This is a very unusual start to a series in which for 6 weeks I'll be talking almost totally about Impressionism, and today about the genesis and the sort of the environment and the background in which Impressionism arose, and after that, more surveying the grounds. In subsequent classes, we'll take up individual artists and their careers before the amazing starting date of Impressionism. Amazing in that there is a specific starting date for Impressionism, and then pick their careers probably into the 1880s. And there will be another series that will pick up some of them who have a much longer career, which would be Renoir and Monet, probably specifically. And the artists who follow sometimes in reaction to Impressionism, and that will be Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, artists from the late part of the century. Now, one reason I just start with that is you should know how very timely this is. First of all, from the screen you see right here, there's an exposition, a show in 1874. And this is a show where Impressionism was born. So it's almost 150 years. In honor of that, there's going to be a really significant show at the Met starting late September and going to the beginning of the new year on Manet and Degas only. It's a show in Paris right now, and then it's coming. And then sort of focusing around this era, and then what's subsequent after this in the National Gallery in London and in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. Right now they have one on after Impressionism and the birth of modern. Well, modern for some people starts in 1850, for others starts in 1874, and others it starts after that. So it's how you slice the loaf. For something in art history and art history of a period where with works that people, I think now more generally enjoy than almost any other kind of painting. This looks like a very dry image. Because I want to talk about this exhibition. I'm trying to stay away from just calling it an exposition, because in English that has a different meaning. And then sort of images of some of the artists who were involved in this show, and then the world that they came from. So the most significant features of why there was this exhibition in 1874. Well, there were a number of primarily young artists who simply couldn't get to an audience that would be interested in buying their paintings. And that's, of course, a critical feature. Well, there will be several artists who had family wealth behind them, but some of them certainly did not, and a couple of them were very poor. So they banded together, a group of them that had been sort of like cafe conversations for about a year, and they decided to band together, and they were going to put on their own show. And I will come back to why that was such a novelty. But the title for this show, first of all, who's going to be in the show? Well, they were going to be in. They invited some of their good friends, and then some of the artists who were in it, especially Degas, who was going to join it. Thought they needed some people who did have some name to draw people to come into to look at this show. Why would everybody want to say, Dora, here are unknown artists. Oh, I've got to go see that. No, they would want someone. So he tried to get in other people, and he he had contacts in Italy and in England, sort of ranging far and wide. So altogether, they got about 30 artists, and each artist could choose what he or she wanted to put in the exhibition. So there were in total about 165 works. And it was held on this boulevard, which was one of the grand new streets in Paris from the completely modernized Paris, which was still developing at this time. And the show is put on by, well, here we would just translate it literally in English as the Anonymous Society, but that's the same as saying a sort of a corporation of artists, painters, sculptors, engravers, and others. And it's an exhibition that's going to be for a month. It starts 2 weeks before the big show in Paris always starts. And then very interesting, it's from 10 to 6 and from 8 to 10 at night. So the hope was that you could get people at any time. They've been out to dinner, they're on their way to the theater, they might stop in and come and just see what's there. They're on one of these major boulevards. What could be more attractive? And then I'll just tell you this is a little bit of arcana for you. It's Renoir's brother who put this all together. And this is where this exhibition of largely unknown, they had something displayed, but just not made the kind of stir that they needed to. The show was in the studio of Nadar, Nadar, who was a very progressive photographer. And he had these third floor, had been his studio shop. And he had just vacated it for other premises. So they took that spot with this faces north, so it had marvelous light, and they set it up almost as if it were in an artist's studio with paintings scattered across the walls. And then they hoped that so many people would come. We will come back to this gentleman in a moment, or in a while. So I'm thinking this is a very familiar Monet to many of you, Poppy Fields. It's a frequent poster. You can get it for the cover for your phone. There's a firm in China that will make reproductions of this as large as you want to hang in your house. Of course, there are posters, there are beach towels with this. Almost all the Impressionist works you can get in these multiple forms, which makes it very hard to get authentic reproductions. And I think this is not an authentic reproduction, of the real painting. This is a reproduction of a photograph. So these artists, they get together. I'll just tell you more about how they put the show together. There had been a group of artists who were going to the cafe in the evening after they spent their day in the studio. Young artists who largely knew one another already from their art school training. And most of them were born right around 1840. So they're the same age, so the same cohort. And they discussed all sorts of things. Probably not all the things that are going to be recorded by anyone's notes from that time, but they were talking about what art should be, what they were trying to do, what was wrong with the art, what was wrong with the art that they couldn't do, that they chose not to do, the kind that would sell easily, why they were willing to go against popular taste, even though they need popular backing. And then how are they going to put this together? Monet and a man named Pizarro were largely in charge of this most practical aspect of it. They decided everybody had to contribute to pay for the rent on that space, for hanging the show, for writing up the brochure, for any publicity there is. So once they had put together this about 30 some artists, they decided on a flat fee that each artist would contribute. And they used as a legal document for this, they used their model was one for a union of bakers. So they followed the legalese language, and they had then these painters, engravers, sculptors. They agreed to put in that money, and their hope was that they would sell that work, and through selling that work, of course, that would pay off what their dues were for joining this union. And of course, they didn't. The show was a wretched failure. Many artists didn't sell anything. I think an artist named Sisley sold the most, which was 6 paintings. Degas sold nothing. I think Monet sold maybe 3 or 4 paintings. But today, you'll know why, despite this abysmal, crushing financial failure, there was some abysmal, crushing critical review that at least made them known, and that makes them known still today. So here are the artists we think of as the Impressionist circle. And I'm not going to talk about them in specific now, because that will be, they'll each merit their own limelight. But here's Monet, a very outgoing, gregarious guy, very involved in this show, prodigiously active as a painter. And this is a portrait of him, he's in his 20s here, by Renoir. And Renoir really, all his life long, relied primarily on portraiture for his economic mainstay. But it seems quite likely that Renoir is a little bit playful here. Now, artists doing portraits of themselves or one another, that's a way they could practice doing faces, doing people, because you could get one of your friends to sit for you, and you couldn't expect any money, but you're getting the experience out of that. And that person then also has some ego gratification. So there was this nice exchange, and they could be talking back and forth while this goes on. So what Renoir has done, showing Monet in an interior here with a curtain drawn back and then a tree just leaning over his head. The thought is that maybe, this, Renoir isn't explicit about this, but maybe that's to suggest like crowning him with laurels, and his round brimmed hat is a little bit like a crown. It's a little bit like an in-joke. I'll give you the artist's lifetime dates now, and then we'll get that again. But so he's born in 1840, and he lives until 1926. And he's very active until almost the end. And here's Renoir. This is done in 1876, and it's in the Fogg Museum at Harvard, so you can go look at it. So, of course, he shows himself painting. You get the idea here in the flurry. Those might be his brushes and also his hand moving. He was at the time painting the ball, the Moulin de la Galette, a painting that sold for almost 80 million in the early 90s. It's a very famous painting. And here Renoir, he concentrates almost solely on his face, and then these are just areas of loosely brushed various colors, every which direction. So he's essentially not showing what he's painting, but he shows how he paints. Degas, who was, well, in Renoir's background, his father was essentially a worker. And so he came from a very, very humble background. And Monet's father was a grocer, and sort of fairly wealthy middle class, but not at all interested in art. But Degas came from greater wealth than that. And here he shows himself as the very debonair, very much the dandy of his day, with his fawn gloves and doffing his hat toward us. This is actually a self-portrait he's done. Now, we think always of, oh, Degas gets lumped in as an impressionist, but he never thought of himself that way. He thought of himself as a realist. And he will, in many ways, be a little bit closer to traditional art than the two younger fellows we just saw. So Degas, he's born in the early 1830s, so he's a little bit older than they are also. But he too was looking for venues for his work. And this is Berthe Morisot, a portrait of her by Monet, who was a good friend, and here a photograph of her. So there were 3 women involved. Well, only 2 showed and 1 didn't show, but they were involved in this group. And she had been very well trained. She's also from an affluent Parisian family. She and her sister Edma had been trained in all the arts, I believe. They both painted. They had very good teachers, not at where everybody else did, because those avenues were not yet available to women. But they were well educated. Their parents saw that they had just all the social skills. Monet once said to a friend, it was a shame that both Berthe and her sister were women, and he wasn't doing that necessarily in a sexist sense, but rather that they wouldn't have the chance to make an impact on the art world that by the character of their work, they ought to. And so Monet's suggestion was that he hoped that they would marry judges of the art exhibitions, so that would be the indirect way. Well, Berthe will get there on her own. And Pissarro, he's older than a lot of them. He was born, well, a decade earlier, 1830. And this is his self-portrait. Others call him Father Pissarro, not only because he was older, but he had a very benign teaching personality. He was the only one, I think the only one, not accustomed in his early youth to the milieu in Paris. He grew up in the Virgin Islands, and he went to sea for a couple of years, but his parents, he was just incorrigible. He wanted to be an artist. So he did come to Paris and study there, which is where he met in the same classes, Monet and Renoir. He is the only man of these people I'm showing you who exhibited in every one of the 8 so-called Impressionist shows. They fit between 1874 and 1888, not a long span of time. And his great good friend, also older, whom he taught a great deal, was Cézanne. And this is Pissarro's portrait of Cézanne, which has that loving, almost wittier quality that Renoir's did of Monet, because here you have the peasant Cézanne, who's from the south of France. Here's a painting by Pissarro, shown down here on the wall. I think this is the newspaper up here. This is what the leading artist you'll see in a few moments, a man named Courbet, Courbet, who was one of the revolutionary artists from around 1850, calling for a complete change in the Paris art establishment. And this man over here was a political figure from that same time, also calling for great change. So it's as if they're doing the equivalent of crowning Cézanne. And because I could not resist, here's Papa, Pissarro, and Cézanne, out for a hike. And here, you're soon going to hear some sounds you don't like. And this is another one by Pissarro, by Renoir, another good friend of him and Monet, and that's Alfred Sisley, who did almost exclusively landscapes throughout his long career. He never had the fame the other two men did. And a man named Armand, I don't want to pronounce this because my French is so bad, Guillaaumin, who actually works with the Impressionists and shows in their shows, but then is also very influential on and works with Van Gogh and somewhat later artists. So those are names we know. I could give you the names of all the other men, the two Autens, Le Pen, Rouart, not names that would be familiar to you, I believe. Some I can't even find images. But here more, Mary Cassatt. This is a portrait by Degas of her, American-born, of course, but she, after being trained at the Philadelphia Academy of Art, traveled in Europe, and then with her sister and then her whole family settled in Paris, and was not at the very beginning, but a few years into the development of the Impressionist group, invited by Degas to join them. And she became a very active participant. And this is the woman who did participate, I don't see them, 2 to 4 times, about whom very little is heard, because her husband, an engraver, was also in the show. They're the Braquemons. Her name is Marie. And her husband didn't like her to paint. So she did not feel free to have the career all the others did. Now, there's several people who are not in that 1874 exhibition, who are truly instrumental to the continuing fame of it, here to the development of it. One is this extraordinarily tall man named Bazille, Bazille, and here he is in his studio in Paris, being visited by Manet, who we'll look at in a moment. And over here, it's thought one of these is Renoir, and then Monet is present. And this is a pianist friend named Maitre. Bazille had been one of those who was first saying, we have to get together a group. And he had great organizational skills. So he was getting the others, sort of shaping their ideas to work toward it. And also he had wealth. So when these poor, luckless, rebellious young artists couldn't find anyone to buy their works and couldn't bow to convention and make works that the major exhibition would allow, he bought them. So he bought their paintings, and some of them are shown up here. This one is by Renoir. This is by Monet. And this is Bazille's painting. Here is the reason he ceases to be important is that I can't be flippant about it. He volunteered during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, 1871, which had Monet fleeing to, and then Pissarro, both going to England to be removed from the fighting. And he fought and died there. So his career came to an end in 1870. And here are two portraits of him by Renoir. And that one where you see that this very casual, you have the idea of just the friends. What Bazille did, he rented a studio in the area, say, not too far from Monet, and he invited at one time Monet, and another time for a year and maybe a little more, that Renoir shared the space with him as a way of alleviating their hardships. And here's another Renoir portrait of him. So also not in the exhibition, not in that exhibition, is Monet. This painting is by a good friend of all of theirs, a man named Fantin Latour, who also was not in. These are men who chose not to join. And Monet, in particular, kept refusing joining. He was extremely elusive, would not explain why he wouldn't. He always wanted to make it, and did make it in the regular, better-known art world. But his ideas, and he was the sort of at this cafe, he's the one who had the two tables every night, or 3 nights a week it was, I think, where these guys would come and talk. So they clustered around him, and his ideas, which he would never put down on paper, no manifesto, were what generated a lot of their thinking and their direction in which they went. And here we have Renoir and Monet and Bazille. This is one of an art critic, and here's that musician. Here's a German visitor. Just a good idea of just the group of these young people, youngish people. And also one in this really gormless painting. It's so awkwardly done, by a man named Caillebotte, Caillebotte, to whom we owe so much. He's younger than the rest and was not even interested in painting until he saw the first Impressionist show. Then he plunged in, but he never needed to make money from it. He sometimes showed with them, he sometimes didn't show, and he did not very much try to sell his works. But what he did was the same thing Bazille had done before, which is to buy up works, to actually, in air quotes, lend money to some of the artists when they were going through periods of destitution, and then buy their work, quantities of their works. And that is something that probably made him more famous, because after his death, he bequeathed all his collection to the French state. The government did not want to accept them. And this is even in his will, he said, and he wasn't going to bequeath it for another 20 years after his death, because he knew he thought it would take a while before people would be interested in this work. But there was a lot of back and forth about this. And now it's primarily the collection that's in the Musée d'Orsay, when finally the government capitulated and took his work. Can you see he's doing what Basile did? This is that Renoir ball at the Moulin de la Galette is up here on the wall. So then one other personage you need to know about is in a later painting, 1910, by later Renoir. This is a dealer, Paul Durand Ruel, who was the first dealer to take up and buy their paintings in quantity. And he was extraordinarily brilliant businessman. And modern galleries are essentially indebted to this man. He came up with the idea of one-man shows, giving retrospectives to artists even during their lifetimes, of hiring good writers to write reviews of their work and write out publications on their works, sometimes buying them himself so that it set the price. He'd buy them at auction. So innocent buyers saying, oh, I like that. How much are those paintings? Now we go into the galleries and you have the person working at the desk gives you a list and you get the price, but he had the price. So he'd say, well, this painting sell for X amount. Well, it's the amount that Durand Ruel had paid. What else did he do? When he had an exhibition of artists' work, if that artist had sold works already, he might ask the buyers if they could borrow them back to put them in the show, so that when visitors came, they said, oh, well, they sell. This person bought that. Oh, okay. That was sort of like the imprimatur. Oh, well, this must be a good artist. I might consider getting one of them as well. And most valuably, Durand Ruel set up a gallery in New York, and he had an exhibition of these artist paintings that traveled. It was New York, Philadelphia. I think it was Cleveland rather than Boston. So he introduced America to it, as did Mary Cassatt, who had her wealthy American friends, when they came, go around with her to galleries or to the artist studios, and she would say, this is someone who really is very fine. You ought to consider supporting this person. You ought to buy some of this person's work. And she would explain them to her. And it's through her good friend that Met acquired most of its very fine Impressionist collection. So circuitously through Mary Cassatt. So then also, what did Durand Ruel do? He would join Caillebotte in financing the artists, not as selflessly as Caillebotte, because he would say, okay, I'll give you this money, you give me your paintings. And that worked out well for everybody. So that's the cast of characters, and I slipped in a little information here and there about it. But now, what is it they were up against? What was it that was making them so resistant, and also the establishment so resistant to them? They started out in a very conventional way. I think maybe I don't want to be dogmatic. I think maybe except for one artist, they all went to Paris to get art education at the École des Beaux-Arts, whose very grand, very Renaissance looking quarters you see here. It's across the Seine from the Louvre. It was a government-sponsored school of art. The French government being more interested in painting and sculpture than almost any other government since the Renaissance, because the French government used the arts as an instrument of state to educate, to aggrandize the fame of people. Well, you know how we now do it through images too, rather than text. And it wanted, it started out quite early, wanting there to be one place where you can get good education. Now, this then becomes known. I mean, artists come from Russia, they come from the US, they come from Great Britain. A few times, not often, they come up from Italy, not very often from Germany. They come to the École des Beaux-Arts to study. They're going to meet other artists there. They're going to be up with whatever is going on. And they can see whatever is in the Louvre, which was, this is before most art museums were founded. Well, if you went to the École des Beaux-Arts, this government-funded institution, you had, I'll just talk primarily about painting. There was a very fixed curriculum that went on for several years. And it was all based on tremendous admiration for classical antiquity. This is the entrance hall. Look, it has a reproduction of the corner of the Parthenon. And you might recognize these are the horses that are up over the entrance to Basilica of San Marco in Venice. And most of these are Greek sculptures. These would be plaster casts. Oh, here are two ladies in the Erechtheum. Here's the winged victory of Samothrace. So this is the standard. The Greek art, that ideal, calm, rational perfection based on the human body, is what art should be. And their teaching was very methodical. Let's see, I think I have. You start by copying works by other artists, and plaster casts. And you start with drawing. And this is one of the academic studies of the drawing of hands. And you see this is from part of a sculpture here. So you would learn to do that, and your teacher would have to pass on that. And you learn about light and shadow, but what mattered most of all was outline, because line was considered to be the most important feature in art. Now, why do they think that? And also, it's very sexist. This is the masculine quality in art because it's rational. You have to think about it. It is that they're looking for classical art. What was their painting? A few paintings in Pompeii had been discovered, but there was not much, certainly no surviving Greek painting that was known. So they had to start work from sculpture. And in sculpture, you're looking at something three-dimensional and bounded. I mean, it has edges. The whole shape is created by the edges that you see. So that leads to this sense. Plus, Michelangelo also had that view. And they revered. So you learn to draw in the most lifelike way. After that, you can draw from the life model. And essentially, well, here there's a female nude, which is fairly rare. Most of the time, it would be male nudes. And the studios, there are a lot of complaints from students here. There's like, especially later in the century when everybody smoked, that you could hardly even see the model, and it was stifling on here and deadly. And if you were stuck in the back, you couldn't see anything. You couldn't see around to other people's easels. And the teacher would go around and critique what you were doing. So, and then you could go into the private studios, the ateliers of various teachers who taught at the academy and then in these private studios. And this is a studio of a much admired in his time artist named Bouguereau, who sits here. Now, this is a photograph from the 1890s, but these are his students. Now, of course, here their works, their studies. So this is, but one thing you cannot help but take away from this is how many young people are aspiring to be artists. That actually reflects something else. The whole change in society and the growth of a middle class, that it's not just the state or the church, which wasn't buying as much anymore, or the aristocracy, or the very, very wealthy that were buying art. Now people wanted something for their houses. So there's a much wider market. And also then it becomes possible for people who formerly would either have been working on family lands or somewhere out there, they now come to the city, and in the new industry, maybe their families work. So they were free to dream of having an art career. So here you see all these youngsters. So you can see, even though that's quite a few people, good for this guy. Art became education, all public education became available to women in France around 1880. And he had a big studio for women. The classes were segregated there. I think they're even in different buildings, one for the men and one for the women. Yeah, he gave them a very good education. He was the bête noire to the Impressionists, because I don't know if I even might have to find again and bring in what he said about it, because he believed wholly in the ideal, the perfected art of the past, that the purpose of art is to give your spirit something ennobling, to give you something to strive for. And there could be nothing better than that in the past. Now, you know, that's a perfectly understandable point of view, that holding out for yourself always a model of something that you think is great and trying to work against something that is great. So, where are these youngsters going to find an audience for their works of art? There were not such things as galleries the way there are now. There were maybe one or two, like Durand-Ruel is just beginning to have a gallery. Some paintings were available in shops that sold paints, because the shops where paints were sold, they're called the colormen who sold them, sometimes like barter, give an artist new materials, in return would take a work of art and put it in a shop window and hope someone would come by and buy it. Or you might, in your studio, if you shared a studio on your own, you might hope you'd have friends come by to get the word out that way. If you knew anybody who wrote for a newspaper or anything, maybe you could find someone who might mention your work. But to get that work in front of many people was difficult, because there were two avenues that dominated. One was the annual salon. It had a long, elaborate title, but it was just called the Salon, where every year artists tried to exhibit their works. And then within 10 years, Paris was, after 1851, was having international fairs, international exhibitions. And this is the building of the exhibition hall in Paris in 1855. Well, in years when there's not used as a fair subsequent to that, the art shows were in here. And there would be thousands of works of art on display. Here, this is a nice lithograph of one of them from this is about later 1850s, I think this one is. Was the great thing when this show opened in the spring. All women would have new frocks. You'd go and you'd meet new people or go to be seen. And the paintings literally are placed cheek to toe, frame to frame, from ceiling to floor, room after room. You'd get little booklets that told you by number what was there, but they're not all, it's not a single artist all grouped together. It's not a single subject all grouped together. And how did you get in here? Well, there were judges. In 1 year, there were more than 3,000 works rejected. The judges tended to be people who taught at the École des Beaux-Arts, or judges who had won prizes at previous exhibitions. So it's a very conservative bias. And there was enough uproar about that. They were beginning to let in one or two, maybe, Corot got in, a couple of other people who didn't come up from the bowels of the establishment. But it was, and it never, well, as you can imagine, with that many works, the judges could never take time to explain to the artists why a work would be rejected. So it must have been just terrible. The only thing, if you finally got in and one of your works won a prize, even an honorable mention, because they were juried then once you were in there too, if you got a prize, from then on, your work was automatically admitted, unless it affected public morals or was considered offensive in various ways. So this was the make or break it place. And here's the photograph of what it looked like. I'll show you this painting. This is by Manet's teacher. So if you want to be seen, if you had money, this is where to put it. You need to pay something on a huge scale to make sure that you're noticed. As judges, especially if they didn't like you, they would do what's called sky you, or put you in what was called the dump, in the back rooms where people were so exhausted they never got to it. So, they could play favorites. And then little works all along here. To just give you an idea. See, this is at the Musée d'Orsay now, that large work. And here it is. And this is the kind of thing so admired. Impeccable finish, incredibly finely detailed, wonderful drawing, so logical, so rational, central focus, central figure, leaning in from the sides, classical figures, classical myths being shown here. Perfect knowledge of perspective. This is ancient sculpture come to life, specific ancient sculptures, in fact. And then there's a little, something you could admire this for all its worthy and noble in quality. And then there's a little, but she's pretty sexy. A little bit cavorting here and there. So there was some sexual appeal to it. And these two men, they're Germans coming down to see Rome in its decadence. And so they represent Northern Europe. And look how they recoil against this licentiousness, this debauchery shown here. So there's a kind of a moral message in it too. So when our artists were young, there is within the salons and in the school, there were actually sort of like two main strains. It's quite typical in French art that they're the cluster in separate groups. But this is by Ingres from around the 1870s. It's called The Source. Well, that's classical. Look at that careful outline. Meticulous, you'd never see the stroke of a single brush when you look at any of Ang's work, when you go to the, look at the Frick collection and portrait he has there, you see nothing that indicates the presence of the artist. And it's remote. She doesn't look at you. She's slightly stylized. I mean, he exaggerates parts of the body. But those who had no knowledge of art could look at it and say, oh, how did he do that? Look how carefully it's done. And then, of course, it's a female nude, which a lot of male buyers found quite interesting. And it's a classical theme. But then there was the other extreme, and that was exemplified in the art of Delacroix, who was still alive when Monet was starting out, and his work was very much enjoyed by the Impressionists, and he encouraged their work and was forever trying to get it into the salons, but couldn't override all the other judges. Delacroix is much freer painting. This is the romantic. It's loose, colorful, vivid, moving, emotionally moving, figures moving, sky moves, water moves. Very opposite to the Ang. And then here, what it would be like going to one of those studios. I mean, to the salon. And this is an aspect, this is by Daumier. True connoisseurs, a total of 6,000 of them. Well, clearly they're not connoisseurs. And this would be a critic. This would be an artist. You know, they're doffing heads, hoping he's going to get a good comment from the artists. He's going to help judge it too on his way. I have to, for these last minutes, I will have to come back and show you some of that, but let me give you something to just get the day started. Finish this hour on something great. Here again, we have that view with Nadar, and it's this figure we're after now. This is a man also very important to the whole development of the fame of Impressionism, Louis Leroy, who was an artist, a writer, sort of a failure at both. And he was in his mid-60s, he wrote a review of this exhibition. And you only get a little of this now, because I'm going to read this whole thing to you. It's long, but you get a sense of this. He writes, it's an ironic review, and this is a painting that's in that first show by Renoir. He presents a review as a dialogue between two sort of hapless guys who wander in, both of them themselves artists. Oh, it was indeed a strenuous day when I ventured into the first exhibition in the company of M. Joseph Vincent, pupil of M. Bertin. Now that's a fictional figure. Landscape painter, recipient of medals and decorations under several governments. So there's medals and decorations in the annual salons. The rash man had come without suspecting anything. He thought he would see the kind of painting one sees everywhere, good and bad, rather bad than good, but not hostile to good artistic manners. Devotion to form, respect for the masters. Oh, form, oh, the masters. Oh, we don't want them anymore, my poor fellow. We've changed all that. Upon entering the first room, Mr. Vincent received an initial shock in front of the Dancer by Renoir. What a pity, he said to me, that the painter who has a certain understanding of color doesn't draw better. His Dance's legs are cottony as the gauze of her skirts. Oh, I find you hard on him, I replied. On the contrary, the drawing is very tight. Monsieur Vincent, believing I was being ironic, contented himself with shrugging his shoulders, not taking trouble to answer. Then, very quietly, with my most naive air, I led him before the plowed field of Monsieur Pissarro. At the sight of this astounding landscape, the good man thought the lenses of his spectacles were dirty. He wiped them carefully and replaced them on his nose. "Oh, by Jove," he cried, "what on earth is that?" "You see, a hoarfrost on deeply plowed furrows. Those furrows, that frost, but they're pallet scrapings, placed uniformly on a dirty canvas. It has neither head nor tail, top nor bottom, front nor back. Perhaps, but the impression's there." And another one. And this is in Philadelphia. Painted by Monsieur Sisley. I'd like to point out the small tree. It's gay, but the impression, oh, leave me alone now with your impression. It's neither here nor there. But here we have a view of Melun by Monsieur Rouard, in which there's something in the water. The shadow in the foreground, for instance, is really peculiar. Oh, it's a vibration of tone which astonished you? Call it sloppiness of tone, and I'd understand it better. Oh, Corot, what crimes are committed in your name? It was you who brought into fashion this messy composition, these thin washes, these mud splashes in front of which the art lover has been rebelling. Oh. I'm still going to give you a little more of this today. This is the Monet. The poor man rambled on this way quite peacefully, and nothing led me to anticipate the unfortunate accident, which was to be the result of his visit to this hair-raising exhibition. He even sustained without major injury in viewing fishing boats leaving the harbor by Monet. Perhaps because they tore him away from dangerous contemplation of this work before the small, noxious figures in the foreground could produce their effect. Unfortunately, I was imprudent enough to leave him alone too long in front of another painting by the same artist. It's either this one or this one. It's actually the street outside Nadara's studio. Aha, he sneered in a Mephistophelian manner. Is that brilliant enough now? There's an impression, or I don't know what it means. Only be so good as to tell me what those innumerable black tongue lickings are at the lower part of the picture. What do they represent? Why, those are people walking along, I replied. Then do I look like that when I'm walking along the boulevard? Blood and thunder, so you're making fun of me at last. But those spots were obtained by the same method as they're used to imitate marble. A bit here, a bit there, slapdash, any old way. It's unheard of, appalling. I'll get a stroke from it for sure. And at that stroke, I think it's a stroke of 4, so we have to leave. So now can you imagine those young artists who can't make it in the grand salons, in front of all those well-dressed people, or in those crowds, had they made it through the judges, then to have this be what publicity they get. And I will continue with more of that next time. We will move into more favorable territory too, I think. Okay, I know that's the end. If there are any, please unmute if you have questions or you want me to go back to anything, I will.
Maggie, this is Pat. Okay. Who painted the portrait of Marie?
Marie Brachmann? Yes. She did.
Oh, okay.
And her work is always more realistic like that.
Okay, thank you. You know, I was surprised that Degas' self-portrait had such clarity. when his ballerinas tend to be kind of fuzzy.
But the ballerinas, most of the ones that look quite fuzzy, are going to be the ones that he's done in chalk, where he
Oh,
works in a different form. The painted ones have still more of an outline,
oh, okay.
but he does over time. You know, he bends a little.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Tough
Anyone else?
times for these young men.
Oh yeah, especially the ones. I mean, I can hardly imagine the ones who were really in exigent financial situation. You know, but I'll get to the point. Of course, they had people who would support them. There are some who wrote about them and gave them moral support. But remind me if I don't remember this next time. In France, no Impressionist painting entered a public collection until 1900. And still Impressionism is famous in this country, not in France.
Right. Well, looking forward to next week. Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else?
Yes, could you please go back to that painting of Bazile's studio, I think it is, with the pianist in the corner?
Yeah. There.
Doesn't the pianist look awfully small compared to everything
Yes,
else?
he certainly does. And Manet did the portrait of Basile, which was he was a looming fellow, but not that big. Yeah, there's you see, most of this was done by Basile, and he's still a young guy. He's not all that good a painter yet. I mean, and try to get this person to sit in this chair. Yeah, you're absolutely right. How it goes from this side, the size of this side of the room to this over here is like, whoops. Good looking. Anyone else? All right, I'll see you next week.